So someone just like give me, I know a couple people had a couple interviews pretty early on in the program. There's someone who's done one or two interviews, maybe want to describe what your experience was like with a whiteboarding question or a technical interview question. Like, what was the process? How did it happen? Was it on Zoom? I know there are a couple folks. Yeah, it'd be cool for the class, and also I'm putting on the teaching hat, and I want to ask people a couple questions to get this ball rolling. I think we've got someone on deck who's sorting out some mic issues. Okay, so while this is happening, like, let me ask the class, what is, for those of you who have not yet gone through the interview process, what is your understanding of like the technical interview process and like a whiteboarding question or technical questions?
I'm not sure if this is correct or not, but is it when you basically have to like write out the code yourself instead of typing it?
Yeah, so you historically, you are totally correct. Like in the before days, before the pandemic, a whiteboarding problem was in person. It meant writing code on a whiteboard to solve a technical challenge or task, and maybe doing some design as well. Depending on, this is more for like mid-level roles where you might be asked about like system design or database schemas. But you also might be drawing on the whiteboard just to think through the problem. It comes from computer science courses where that's how a lot of this material was taught. And traditionally, kind of the problems have been algorithm and data structures focused. So, especially because we're writing out the code, it kind of changes the whole thing. A huge part of this is the process. I would say it's 60% process, 40% solving the problem. You cannot finish or solve a whiteboarding problem and still get hired. The interviewer wants to, how you think, wants to see how you think. It has evolved over time, and it's not always this, but this was like 5-ish years ago. I feel like when I was doing a lot of interviewing, this was what I would do a lot. I would go in person to a company. Also, I think the context here is the interview process, 3 to 5 interviews. These days, you have to get past a resume screen, right? There's often a coding challenge on LeetCode or something similar. And then maybe there's a technical conversation, Maybe there's a behavioral question. And then maybe there's a technical interview whiteboarding problem. And each of these is about 1 hour. Sometimes there could be like a take-home programming assignment over the weekend. And then there's usually like the final interview. And if you get that far, you probably will get an offer if you don't do something that causes people a lot of concern. Like for me, that often would be like at a startup, like a short chat with the CTO or something like that. I shouldn't say probably get an offer, but if you're here, you're in the running, because sometimes there's a different candidate that's just farther along in the process. Not every company does this many steps. Sometimes it might just be 1 or 2 rounds. Sometimes they get a little crazy and it can be 6 or 7 rounds. So we'll talk about this bigger picture more, but it's why it's super important to have like a process and a system, and to kind of analyze like, all right, what do I want to do in order to do well at each step? Because it's a beast. It's software engineering hiring is a little crazy. The flip side is we don't have to get a law degree. We don't have to go to medical school for 4 years. That's kind of the trade-off of this industry. We have to go through this audition process for job hunting, but we don't have to go to law school or medical school. And I want to share that because this can be a very frustrating process for everyone, myself included. And reminding myself of that helps me calm myself down. So I think that's the important perspective. And so the whiteboarding problem kind of happens usually in like the 2nd or the 3rd round, right? The order here is not fixed. Every company kind of does it differently. And does someone want to talk a little bit maybe about their interview experience, if they're kind of set up and ready to go?
I could talk about it, Adam.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
I did two interviews. Both of them started with an initial screen from a recruiter over the phone. I'm assuming before I got to the recruiter, I went through some resume screen before they even decided to call me. Then I met with the second interview was half behavioral and half a coding challenge. And they, after the behavioral questions that were very typical, when you worked as a team, the stuff like we've been covering. And after that, he taught me, quote unquote, taught me about a new function or something, something that a new process. And I don't even think it was real. I think it was something he made up, to be honest. And I had to take what he gave me and make something, like work with it in a whiteboard. And I had to talk him through how I thought I could use it. And then then they wanted 3, oh my gosh, it was crazy. They wanted 3 more technical interviews after that.
Yeah.
It was insane.
Yeah.
I didn't get that. I actually didn't get that far because I was trying to get into Platoon, and when I was accepted, I finally just took it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they wanted 2 more. The next one was all technical coding challenges in C++, and it was live in front of 2. This time it was 2 engineers from the team that would actually be working with. And then I stopped. And then there's another one where same process in the beginning as the previous one, with initial screening. then talking to a recruiter on the phone or Zoom or something. And then this one was the most recent one with Liberty Mutual. And they, for their technical coding challenge interview, it was half behavioral. And then the second half was two coding challenges. And each were, you only had 15 minutes to complete each challenge. And then you had to explain your process. Like you basically had to narrate what you're doing the whole time.
Yeah.
Um,
And let me jump in there. That is a very accurate and like pretty typical description of what the hiring process can look like for a software engineering role. And kudos for like tackling that, especially before kind of going through Code Platoon. You know, you mentioned they wanted you to code either C or C++. I will say sometimes it turns out that the fit is not right for a role, and that is okay and not a reflection on us. Like if a company wanted to hire me to write C++, I would not be that guy. I haven't worked with it. So sometimes companies don't know that, and you figure that out in the process. And that's one of the realities of this. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that experience. And yeah, a lot of folks mention like stage fright. Someone asked about what's a technical conversation. That's a great question. That is actually, I think, the best interview form for a software engineer. The challenge is, I think it takes a decent amount of experience on the interviewer's part and also interpersonal kind of emotional intelligence sort of to do that well. It would be like, tell me about a project that you've been working on, or what's a technology that you're interested in. And you basically talk tech, for lack of a better word. And what they want to see is there something that you're passionate about? And like, how well are you able to explain yourself? And then the interviewer will ask questions too, to get a sense of like, how much have you really done with this? For example, we're doing stuff with React now. So the interviewer might be, cool, so with your project, like, did you use React Router? And did you you might be like, yeah, I did. And they might be like, did you end up kind of using browser router or hash router? And, you know, why'd you decide to do that? And then ideally you want to be able to talk about the why behind that choice, because that's so much of what software engineering is. And that tells you a lot about that person's comfort level with the technology. And that's why, and because this is such a process, I really think the only way to kind of set yourself up for success is to like, you got to pick one area to start with and master it, essentially. Like pick Python or JavaScript and go deep into that language. You know, if you pick Python, pick Django as a framework to go deeper. If you pick JavaScript, pick React. To some degree, we have to have breadth, but having some depth somewhere is really important, because if someone sees that there's one thing that you do like have a strong understanding of, they'll be like, okay, this person understands this, they can do stuff with it, they can learn other things. That's really what this whole process is testing for, is our ability to learn and pick stuff up, as well as some applied skills. And as you mentioned, the whiteboarding interview has kind of evolved over time. It probably will be over Zoom. You will probably write code. It could be in your own text editor. It could be in a Google Doc. It could be an Elite Code thing. And it's not always going to be an algorithm or data science problem these days. So let's talk now. I know this has been a bit of a preamble, but let's talk now about, and this is also, by the way, like you will develop and we will help you develop like a study routine and like a daily routine to kind of like practice and keep your skills sharp. Because the other part of this process is you will probably go through multiple rounds. So it's not just about doing something once, it's about doing something repeatable. And the analogy here is, I think about basketball and think about free throws. Think about how many times basketball players practice those free throw shots. And that's not the only part of the game, but that's an important part of the game. And just like kind of practicing those fundamentals. And the biggest fundamental is doing basic programming tasks in your language, right? Like manipulating nested arrays or nested lists, manipulating dictionaries in Python, manipulating JavaScript objects, being really comfortable with that stuff. That's always the starting point on where you should focus, because everything else builds on that. And if you're shaky there, it's going to be extremely difficult to like perform well repeatedly throughout this process. Any questions before I kind of share some slides and start talking about tackling the interview itself? Oh, Luis, yeah, Cassie is going to do some workshops and on doing leak code problems. And we're going to do, I think, at least a couple of those. Okay. So this is the basics of the whiteboarding process. I'll talk through it, and then we'll talk through it a bit more, and I'll add a bit of context. And then I will probably check in with Zainab on time. And if we have time, I might do a whiteboarding problem and model this process. And what we'll be doing a couple times a week for the next several weeks is choosing a volunteer to do an actual kind of technical problem with Zainab or myself, or maybe one of the TAs as an interviewer, either as a whole class or breaking into smaller groups and getting practice. And I saw a couple folks mention stage fright. Stage fright is real. I get it, as in I get stage fright. Preparation helps a lot. There's a lot of tricks I've learned over the years, from teaching, from doing these interviews, from playing music. The best thing is simply getting experience doing interviews. And I always line up some companies I don't want to work at to interview first, because I know that I'm going to be rocky when I start this process. Everyone is rocky. This is very much its like own skill. And this is also why we kind of encourage folks not to spend too much time on this in job hunting until after graduation. Because you really want to be able to put all your energy into this process. So the big picture here is our job is to show the interviewer how we think and make sure that they know how we think. Like, we might have awesome thoughts about how to solve this problem, but if we don't say them out loud, the interviewer will never ever realize that. Repeating the question to make sure we understand it, talking about the question and analyzing it, talking about how we want to solve it before we solve it at like a high level, sketching it out and doing some pseudocode, writing the actual code, talking about how you would test it. And then this last point here is the most important, which is always be speaking your mind, never go silent, always be asking questions. Sometimes the problem, it might not be impossible, but it might be hard, really hard. Or there might be a gotcha. It might be designed where the interviewer is expecting you to have to ask questions. It is usually a collaborative process. I'll talk about this more too, but it's always a good idea to like ask, if you're not sure, ask how they want you to go about solving the problem. Like, it's never a bad idea to ask up front, like, do you want to do this collaboratively? Would you like me to explain my process? What would you like me to do? It is usually like 75% of the time going to be a collaborative process. The interviewer not only wants you to ask questions, they expect you to ask questions, and asking for help doesn't count against you. It's a point in your favor, because we're applying for junior software engineering roles. We're not expected to be experts, even with the things that we're learning here. We're just really on the beginning of our journey into these things. If you go into a junior front end role, in 6 months, you will know way more about React than you ever wanted to know. I promise. So the interviewer isn't expecting you to be an expert. They're expecting you to be someone they can work with, someone who asks good questions, someone they can train, someone they can mentor, and someone who it has some analytical skills and programming skills to bring to the table as well. But that's why the thought process is so important. And I'm just going to copy this stuff in here, because I'm going to add a couple points and context. So repeating the question, why do we want to repeat the question? I'm not asking rhetorically. I would love a couple thoughts, and then I'll share a couple thoughts.
It shows that we were listening and that we understood the question.
Yeah, shows we are listening.
It helps us better understand it ourselves.
Yeah,
Out loud.
It
Yeah.
also gives both sides a chance to clarify if there is a misunderstanding. Because sometimes
exactly.
words don't word the right way.
Yeah, exactly. That's an excellent point, Icarus. As you all have discovered with our daily assignments, people make mistakes. Sometimes there's a mistake. The sort of like meta lesson here, I think, is don't make assumptions, confirm assumptions, double check assumptions. These are all excellent points and all extremely important. The most critical of which I think is making sure we really do understand the question, and that not just that we understand the question, that the interviewer knows we understand the question. That's where repeating the question helps. Also, to be completely honest, it also buys us time. That is time where you are explaining your thought process, and it gives your brain a little bit of time to digest, to get situated, especially in terms of stage fright and anxiety. Like it's not going to hurt to take your time to really walk through the question, and you can lay out a lot of stuff as you go. I will actually, if I'm taking notes on paper, I will just tell the interviewer that I'm taking notes on paper. You know, I'm not going to like hold up my notepad and show them, but you really do want to put your whole process out there. I will Google stuff during these questions, because if I'm like unsure of how to use .filter in JavaScript or something, that is not what we're being tested on. If we have that memorized, we're being tested on if we're comfortable enough with that to do real work. So if it takes me 30 seconds to Google JavaScript's .filter, I'll confirm with the interviewer that they're okay with that. I'll do a quick Google search, and then I'll get that working and talk about that as I do that. And then if I get stuck, I'll switch gears and use something else like a for loop instead of .filter. I think those are the major points with repeating the question. And it's a really, really important step. It also is where we kind of are establishing a dialogue. And Icarus, you made a great point about that. Like we do want to get a good, healthy dialogue going with the interviewer. So Usually there's some sort of function or algorithm. And let me look here because I might have, yeah, these are all sub bullet points. Let me, in fact, start with this. Usually, there's going to be a function algorithm, and there's going to be some kind of input to it. What are the inputs? What type of input? What shape of input? What? And I think, like, can there be different types? It's a great question. And think out loud about edge cases. Edge cases are going to be a recurring theme here. Special characters for strings, 0 or negative numbers, or ints, etc. When in doubt, just say you'll handle an edge case later. Sometimes the interviewer might be, well, what do you think? And a great answer is, I think that's something that's important to handle, but we can probably get like a first draft implementation working and come back to it. But think that through to make sure that it's not an important edge case, because sometimes there are important edge cases that are specific to the problem. In its own category, I'm going to put input size and bounds, especially if it's an algorithmic problem. Like if we have to sort through a list of users to find a specific email, how big is that list? 10 users, 100 users, 100,000 users, 1 million users. There's a couple reasons to do this. Asking shows that you understand that input size affects performance, right? If we have a list of 20 million users, we probably have to write a dramatically different program than a size of 200. You usually, a good approach is always to prototype for a small input size and worry about a big input size later. The interviewer will usually ask you to do this. But asking these questions up front shows that we have an understanding of the possible kinds of input and the effects that has on our program's performance and the kind of program that we have to write. And let me check in and see if people have questions. And let me look at the chat as well. So that's a good one. And then I'm going to put edge cases here again. Because this is, I think, where a lot of the gotchas for these kinds of problems come in edge cases. And so an interviewer will really appreciate and value you thinking through and talking through that up front. And then talking through what kind of output do we expect? Should I return a string? Should I return a dictionary? Do I want to return like a human readable message? Missing like a detail in the output specification is a common gotcha. Think about assessment 2 with the coins and the pennies and the dimes, where you sort of had to handle creating a friendly message with like correct punctuation and stuff. So if nothing else, writing down the requirements for the output is important. And on that note, I would say, like, this is clearly, like, while you're doing this process, this is way too much information to keep in your head when you're on the spot in a 1-hour technical interview. Write it down as you go. Ideally on the screen, if not on a piece of paper, and let the interviewer know that you're writing it down. I would recommend think through the simplest possible version of the problem. And let me rephrase that. Think through, and in fact, not just think through, but talk through the simplest possible version of the problem. This is a really useful and common tactic, right? Think about the simplest possible way you can do this and talk this through. And you might even end up writing pseudocode or code for this. This one is going to sort of bleed into the previous point, but explain, and it's okay to think out loud while doing this, how you want to solve it, what your strategy is. And honestly, this might be your strategy. You might say, my strategy is, I'm not totally sure yet, so I want to think of a really simple use case and step through it and write that code, and I think that will help me get to the next step. And I think it's never a bad idea to ask the interviewer, what do you think? Does that make sense? Because there's a good chance the interviewer will say, yes, I think that does make sense. Or they might say, well, maybe, but actually, I think this other approach might be better. Or they might say, well, maybe, can you explain it a bit more? Give the interviewer opportunities to ask questions. Approach the process collaboratively, excuse me. It's not completely collaborative. They're still looking for you to solve the problem, but they want to see how you work with someone else. Basically, they want to figure out, if we're pair programming together, will that be a productive session? This is someone that you might be working with. And it, again, just shows your awareness of the process. Any questions? Great question, Lily, how to do this in 15 minutes. And Icarus, great point. The interviewer is not your enemy. I think I'll put that one up there. They, in fact, are your ally. You know, sometimes you might get an interviewer that's not the best ally, and that takes practice. And to be honest, that also might be a sign that that workplace might not be the right fit. Sometimes it's also simply luck of the draw with the interviewer. Lily, the answer to your question of how you do this all in 15 minutes is, I'm being pretty comprehensive in my outline here. You don't necessarily, I think it's important to go through all of these steps to begin with. But when you have a real problem, a lot of these sort of collapse and condense, and a lot of this, once you do about 10 practice problems, and that's the real answer, is you practice this process. Because I can get through these steps A and B in about a minute with the problem, but that comes with practice. And both practicing with other people, like we will do in class, and also practicing this process on your own with problems from Leak Code, or we'll look at this site project Euler or other places. The answer is practice, and then a lot of this moves swifter. Kayla, that's a great question about time management. That is a good point. That is something I actually often struggle with, which probably is not a surprise to folks. And actually, let me add a point about that. Time management is an important part of this process. It's like a miniature version of the assessments that you all have been working on, where you do have to make some project management, time management decisions about when it's time to move on, when it's time to move on to something else, when it's time to try a different strategy if you get stuck. And I think that the best way to improve at that is simply practice. And I do think Leak Code has something to offer there because those problems are timed, right? It's just going through the process as much as anything will help with that. That's a really good point about time management. Thank you for mentioning that. And the time is from the beginning of the interview to the end. It will probably be an hour on the calendar. And so the interviewer will probably get you into the problem relatively quickly. And actually checking in or asking the interviewer about time is never a bad idea. And saying out loud if you are stuck is never a bad idea, because this demonstrates awareness of the importance of like time in project management in software. This is sort of like a miniature project, right? So if you realize that you're getting stuck, saying to the interviewer, hey, like, I thought I had a path forward. I'm actually running into a problem here. I want to check in because I know we've only got 20 minutes left and maybe get some help, or what would you like us to do next? That is a great strategy. Thomas, great question about language. In fact, I should put this up here. Before every interview, like 1 to 3 days, I will confirm the language that the interview is going to be in, the nature of the task. Sometimes they tell you, sometimes they don't. And the name and the role of who's interviewing me. Usually you can pick the language. Sometimes not. If they want you to interview in a programming language that you're not familiar with, you need to let them know up front. Otherwise, they'll have false expectations and it won't go well. Just be very clear. Hey, I'm happy to try this. I do not have experience in this language. I do have experience in this language. What would you like to do? And that should be on them. And honestly, that's the interviewer's job to figure that out. And some companies are good at that. Some companies are less good. The pseudocode with your interviewer step, I think I kind of have really talked through the pseudocoding process already. And then writing code, I think the really important thing here is work in small chunks. Get each chunk working before you move on. And start with the simplest possible implementation and get that working. And don't be afraid to ask questions, ask for help, check in. And don't be afraid to switch gears if you get stuck. And most of all, keep talking. Keep talking with the interviewer. Explaining how you would test it. This is always good to do and to be ready for. I think the focus is clearly on steps 1 through 6. If you get a good implementation, at that point, it starts to be smoother sailing. Step 8 is often for these kinds of questions, there will be sort of like follow-ups. It depends on how far along the interviewee gets. If the interviewer starts asking you questions or making the problem more difficult, that's actually a good sign. So don't stress out. I know that can be unexpected. So that's kind of my walkthrough, and I'll make sure to share this doc, and that's why I wanted to record this as well. Speaking of time and time management, it is 9:30. So let's check in about what we want to do next.